Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. We're going to get into an interesting topic tonight, losing church and finding God. Hey, Sissy. Hey, Jean. Shabbat Shalom. Hey, Randall. Shabbat Shalom. Good to see you all. Hope everyone is doing well. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Welcome to Sabbath Collective, a community of people interested in celebrating the Sabbath and pursuing God through a Hebraic worldview of the Bible. So we are continuing with this really interesting series, Losing Church and Finding God. And tonight we're specifically going to look at one of the several places we can find him, which is in humanity. And so oftentimes one of the things that people are very concerned about when they've made a decision to leave a more organized Western church is, where will I find God, and am I walking away from God? And Andre began this series with some really interesting points. We continued it last week. And again, if you are in a local community, a local faith community, and you're happy there, and it's your church and you serve and everything's going good, great, good for you. But there's a lot of us who are really wrestling with a sort of dissatisfaction with the local Greek Western church. And so this is really for all of us who are wrestling through what that means to leave, if that's okay to leave, and if so, where do we find what our souls are really looking for? So we're going to begin with a very familiar verse that most of us know. It's Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, in the likeness of ourselves." And you've probably heard this many times. There's actually a lot of different opinions about this plurality here and what God was referencing. But here's the thing that we really need to know. The simple way to relate to this is he said us and our when he was talking about the design of mankind. And that's for a reason. Every word is important, right? So this plurality, this community is something very important, and it's part of our design. Biblical history shows the value and the importance of community. And Yahweh establishes and protects community in his laws. And by the way, if you get hit with something that's really, oh my gosh, I've thought that, I've heard that, I've questioned that. Hey, Erin, hopefully you're in between shows now and you're joining us. Good to have you. Hey, Diana, Shabbat Shalom. Good to see you. And so, again, if this resonates or you have a question, pop it up there so we can respond to it. But Yahweh really establishes and protects community in his laws. And that kind of suggests the importance of it. There is a rhythm in a faith community that sets up a remembering. So let's read that again and think about these words. There's a rhythm in a faith community. Again, this is the design of God for community that sets up a remembering. And so God knows that we all have this sort of individualism in us, right? We just want to detach and do our own thing. And once we get into that individual lifestyle and this detachment, we could kind of disconnect from everything important, including remembering. And so what he did was set up this sort of calendar, this rhythm in this community that sets them up for remembering. Festivals were about remembering the varying attributes and actions of Adonai, right? Along with his ways that are lived out within the community. The festivals were also a way to connect to the history as a people. So in other words, when people came together, which at least 3 times a year was a mandate in the temple, when they came together to celebrate festivals or came to their local houses, and even when they come together on the Shabbat, they oftentimes reconnect to the history as a people, which is very important. and there is a recommitment to the Lord and to each other. So this is really genius, of course, because, this is what Yahweh does when he sets these things up, these laws up. It's not for no reason. It's to establish community so that they will not forget. Our design is to be part of a community, and that community helps us to remember. So, what is a faith community? A faith community is a joining of people where connection with each other and with Yahweh on the very level of the soul happens. Um, Meaning, it is a very deep thing that happens. A community is more than just individual friendships, right? It is a culture, an atmosphere where values are actually lived out. Now, here's the thing. Oftentimes, when I talk to people and maybe they had a community that was really very special to them, and I've had a few of them in my life, very special communities of people, and a lot of you have been part of that, of those communities. And oftentimes we hear people say, we'll never find another community like, and then fill in the blank. And there's this kind of nostalgia and this longing and this hopelessness. Like, oh, we had it and we lost it and we'll never find community like that again. And I found myself even doing that with eras, like it's Woodstock's 50th anniversary, right? So, of course, I watch the show on Netflix, and I'm watching the show on Netflix, and I'm saying things like, oh my gosh, remember when people did this? Remember when this happened? Why can't we have this anymore? So we kind of want to go back to this precious time. But here's really the thing to remember. And we can remember them with fondness and we can really love and be thankful for them. But community doesn't die at that place. And also, here's the thing, and this is very, very, very important. Healthy communities are not magic. They don't just appear out of nothing. Okay, and this is kind of how we look at them, like they're this elusive magic mystery that happens and we step into it and we become part of it, and then when they're gone we'll never be able to find that magic thing again. Healthy faith communities are not magic. They don't just appear out of nothing. They are created and curated, and that's something that we really need to understand. If you have ever been part of a healthy community that was very special, it was created and it was curated. And yes, there's a supernatural part to that that sort of adds these useful pieces to the community. That's what the Lord does. But the people take care of it. And they do that by viewing all behaviors and decisions through the lens of their community's cultural values, which means a good community can start out great and lose its way if it's not curated, right? Somebody has to keep their eyes on what's going on. A lot of people have to keep their eyes on what's going on. So a healthy community is both created and curated. And that's very important to know. It's not magic. You can have it. You can be part of it. So let's look at what that is. And by the way, give me a thumbs up if you've ever fallen into that thinking that, oh, well, I'll never have that again. Or I had this community and it's gone and I'll never have it again. Give me a thumbs up if that resonates with you, and maybe a wow face if you never looked at it like healthy communities are created and curated, which means you can have them again. So, what do they look like lived out? And again, this is a very familiar verse. Most of us know this verse. And it really shows us what happens in the community. It says here in Acts 2:42, I see that thumbs up, Diana. It says in Acts 2:42, and they continued faithfully in the teaching of the emissaries or the apostles, right? In fellowship, in breaking of bread, and in prayers. Now, let's kind of break down what this community did and what they looked like. okay, so that we can understand what a healthy community really does. And they continued faithfully, we read. That word for faithfully is a Greek mouthful, proskartereo, which means adhere to, are consistent to, and are devoted to. So it says here about this group that they're talking about that they continued consistently, that they were adhered to one another, that they were devoted to one another in the teaching. And we have a phrase in our community, which you probably heard. For those of you who've been around a little bit longer, you've heard it a lot: learning to learn. So when we get together and there's teaching and there's discussion and there's wrestling through things, part of that learning is that we're learning to learn. It's very important. So in the teaching, they're learning to learn from the emissaries or from the apostles. And we read in fellowship. Fellowship is the Greek word koinonia, which you probably are familiar or have heard about it before. It means community. Now, listen, when we say community, it's more like, oh, yeah, we get together and everyone maybe looks the same or acts the same or talks the same, and or I feel comfortable. This is what community looked like lived out. Remember, some of these people sold every single thing that they had and gave it to the community. And they fed people like widows and orphans, and they took care of their teachers so their teachers would not have to worry about anything but teaching them. And if you traveled from a long distance to come to be a part of that, they would open up their house and let you stay with them. That's the kind of koinonia that we're talking about here, that they had for each other, and they gave it to this movement. In breaking of the bread, hey Ryan in Taiwan, good morning to you. By the way, what's 7:15 here? 7:11 actually here is 7:11 in the morning for the Keysleys. So it's good to have you join us, Ryan and Anita, if you're awake, or maybe you're sleeping in with little baby. So again, they would die for the movement. In the breaking of bread, a lot of times people are confused with what this means, and they think it's communion, which is tradition, which is not what they're talking about when it talks about wine and bread. The Talmud, which is the Jewish oral law, uses the term only in reference to the blessing at the start of a meal. So at every meal, it was and is the custom to have bread and wine. Bread and wine. How many people love that already? Bread and wine, right? The blessings over the bread and wine are said at the beginning and the end of the meal. And the one who recited the blessing did so while they literally broke the bread and passed it around for everyone to have a piece of it. So breaking of bread, especially in this Eastern community, referenced prayer and peace in unity in the meal. So when you sat around and ate with someone and there was the prayers that were prayed, the blessing before and the blessing after the meal, there was no rift in between anybody. Everybody was at peace with each other. And finally, we see the prayers, and in the prayers, and the prayers are the Amida prayer, which, if you remember years ago, I did a study about the Amida prayer where I broke down every sentence, but it's the prayer that Jewish people pray 3 times a day. Maybe when you see them on the street and they're praying and davening, they're praying the Amida prayer 3 times a day. So these are the prayers, these ritual structured prayers that we're talking about. And this text in Acts is referencing this group of at least 3,000 people that had that Shavuot Pentecost experience written about in Acts, right? So after that happened, they gathered in smaller communities together. And the apostles traveled from house to house, from community to community, sharing their yokes. And you know full well, a yoke is a belief system. And what it means, what a yoke is the rabbi's particular way that he interpreted and applied scriptures. And it had to do with everything from how to wash your hands to how to spend your money to how to love your partner, everything. It had to do with everything. And so they taught interpretation and application in this very diverse and messy group of Jewish people and Gentiles and everything in between that were just learning how to be a faith community. So there was learning and prayer and accountability and commitment and encouragement going on in these places. A faith community is the place of our learning to learn journey. It supports us in that process, a place where we pray for one another and we find God in those others. We had in our membership group this past week, one of us just got done with his radiation treatment, and he posted a picture of him ringing the bell. And some of us related to that picture even more than others because of personal connection to that. But all of us, our heart went out to him because we've been praying him through this process. That's what a faith community does. It is the metaphor of his body on earth, and we find God in those others. When I'm accepted, when I'm encouraged, when I'm loved, when I'm taught, I not only feel that from people, but from Yahweh through those people. When I am challenged by someone who loves me, when I am held accountable for my behaviors that are maybe a little outside of what I say are my faith values, I then know that this person loves me enough to call me out on it. And that calling it out in love helps me to not fall into this dark pit of self-deception. When I confess something to someone, and I think, oh my gosh, when they hear what I've done and what a horrible person I just was, they will never be able to love me or look at me again. And when I hear them forgiving me and praying with me and encouraging me, when I see that in them, then somehow I know God forgives me too. When I hear others talk about how Adonai teaches them or answers a prayer, I then know God can teach me and answer my prayers too. Now, this is not experienced a lot of times in the kind of Western Greek faith communities that are a mile wide and an inch deep, right? I mean, we just don't have these kinds of experience. Hey, Josh, great to have you join us. Shabbat Shalom. In healthy communities, one can ask for guidance about how to handle, let's say, a difficult relationship, or about how to live on a budget, or how to stay faithful in marriage. Things that reflect the commitment and values of a person. One can throw out a quick update or text for prayer and know that someone is with you, metaphorically walking on the road with you, even if they live across the country. And we can be grateful to have people ask us how it's going. The community gives us a place to work out our growth, our struggles, our achievements, and even our crash and burn disappointments. And in these kinds of communities, and this is the important one, it's function over form, right? Because again, this series is about for those of us who really feel like they've either done this or are considering leaving this more organized religious institution in search of something different. It's function over form. In fact, you can have different kinds of communities and even changing communities. We have someone in our community in Sabbath Collective that is part of a community that prays together. They're all fathers, young men that are fathers, and they get together and they pray together because when they're in this group, they think, oh my gosh, what the heck are we doing? We don't know how to do this. And so they get together and they pray together. And when they do that, there's no pastor there. There's no spiritual leader there. It's a bunch of young dads that are getting together going, oh my gosh, we need help. And can I be honest with how scared I am about this? We have people in our Sabbath Collective community who are part of book club communities where they read a book and they come together and they discuss it. Maybe it's a faith book that they're reading and they're talking and they all have different opinions and different questions. You do not need a pastor or even a leader to have a healthy faith community. Now, I will qualify this. Everyone needs a rabbi, as the saying goes. Someone who's really looking over you, who's not necessarily just your friend. Someone who prays for you diligently, who will tell you the truth, who you can go to with questions, who can teach you. Everybody needs that. But that relationship doesn't necessarily have to be part of a faith community that you're part of. Someone who is teaching you and knows you and that you're covered in the dust of your feet. The person that I had for decades lived in another state. She was a pastor of her own church. I didn't go to her church and she didn't go to mine, but she was my teacher, my rabbi, my person who I went to. The teacher does not have to be part of your faith community, and the faith community can be important, can be real. The structure is not the point. The relationships are the point, okay, in the faith community. When we see these things, when we feel this, and when we know this deeply, we find God. So, for those of us who have maybe lost church out of a decision, we can find God in a community where humanity is supported. Now, let's break down what that looks like. Because I don't know about y'all, but I find that we are living in crazy times. I mean, I will be 62 tomorrow, actually. I'll be 62. I have never seen anything like it, and I lived through the 60s and the 70s, which also had some pretty crazy things happening. But today, I think I lost you a little. I'm not sure if I lost some of you or not. If I lost the connection, I just had something come up and say the stream just restarted. So if I did lose you, if I lost you there for a second, if it glitched, this is all being recorded. It's why we got the Mevo, and it's going to be posted in its entirety, okay? So we can, again, lose church and find God in community where humanity is supported. So in these days, have you ever had someone talk to you? Because we're talking about seeing God in humanity. And oftentimes nowadays, I hear people talk about some crazy political, okay, good, right? I see that. Some crazy political or religious leader or some racist neighbor. And they say, well, they're made in the image of God too. Could I see a thumbs up if you've been told that by religious folks? When you're complaining about some insane president or somebody that you really think is just out of their mind, and as you're complaining, they say this, well, just remember they're made in the image of God too. So you need to see the good in them. If you've ever been told that, give me the thumbs up. And then here's what they also say within that vein of thinking. Here, wait for it because you know it well, and I'm sure you've been told it. None of us are perfect. They're only human. And tonight we're talking about seeing God in humanity. And I don't know about y'all, but there are some humans that are on the public platform that the last thing I see anywhere near them is God. Right? Is it you too? So when people say that and use this scripture about being made in the image of God, that we're all being made in the image of God and we're all human, and then they use being human as a kind of excuse to do bad things, right? And that we just have to overlook it because we're all human. And then I'm thinking, well, if that's what humanity looks like, I don't see God there. And yet, we should see God in humanity. So where's that disconnect? As it always is, it's in the context. Okay? So let's look at an interesting verse, Colossians 3:10. It says this, and having put on the new self, which is continually being renewed in fuller and fuller knowledge, closer and closer to the image of its creator. Now, let's take a look at this oftentimes used verse of the image of God and how we're all made in the image of God. This verse in Colossians, Paul is the only New Testament author who uses this for the phrase image of God in the same technical sense found in Genesis 1:26. And there are actually 4 times that Paul uses this expression. He connects the new self with the image of the Creator. Now, if we're made in the image of the Creator, and there's this connection with Genesis 1. So the Genesis 1:26 verse that we started tonight talking about, right? Let us make man in our image, right? Paul is specifically, intentionally connecting us to Genesis 1:26 with this because the technical use of this phrase, okay? So common sense dictates that man cannot mean or cannot be, as human beings, a physical carbon copy of God, right? How can that be? Human beings aren't physical carbon copies of God, since God is invisible and God is a spirit. So what is the image of God? And when we use this Genesis 1:26 verse all the time, and we say people are made in the image of God, so when we see everyone on the planet, they're all made in the image of God, and they're only human, so we should love them and see good in them anyway. Paul actually points to Yeshua as the example of what this looks like on earth. In Colossians 1:15, Paul states Yeshua is the image of the invisible God. So Paul has taken this verse in Genesis, moving it down to this verse here about how we're growing in the image of God, and then saying, oh, do you want to know what the image of God looks like? Right there is Yeshua. Look at Yeshua in Colossians 1:15. That's the image of God. In Hebrew thought, the whole structure of the world is about participation, relationship, and representation. We begin our lives being formed, being made in God's image. But we live in God's image by participation, by relationship, and by representation in our actions, like Yeshua when he did the will of the Father. Doing what Yeshua did produces the same image of him in us on earth. And this is what it means to be human. Now, here's the amazing thing. When I was in Israel, I actually learned this revelation from Rabbi Bob Gorlick, who was one of our teachers and guides there. And I made that reference about, well, I guess we're only human. And he said, yeah, Americans say that all the time, and they don't understand what that means. And he gave me this lesson. But here's the thing. To be human is to have my presence as the reflection of God in the world. So being made in the image of God, humanity being made in the image of God, is that reflects God in the world. So if someone is not reflecting God in the world, not only are they not portraying the image of God, they're not even acting human. Now it all makes sense, doesn't it? When we say, how can a human being do that? They're not acting like human beings. Paul says we're being renewed. Being in the image of God is not an instant transformation. It's not a Greek event, right? It's a Hebraic process that takes time. Image is what image does. And a person is either doing the image of God or not. We find God in the humanity of connected faith communities where people are growing in that purpose. We also find God in larger communities of humans functioning in his image. So we find them in small, intimate communities. We can also find them in larger, like minded communities. And in those communities, it's interesting, we can be part of communities, not even necessarily know each other's names, but it's a kind of community that strengthens and encourages and imparts power for the work. And these are the kind of communities that are working for, let's say, justice, racially, environmentally, economically. These communities fulfill a function. And the really interesting thing about these kinds of communities, this is another kind of a community that we can be a part of, where when we're part of this community, that's where we find God. The God energy that is found and shared in being part of an active, learning, growing, purposeful movement can change the world. In other words, when we're part of these kinds of community, they literally can change the world, and that's where you can find God. So, have you lost the church? Are you looking to find God? Look in a community, in a true community, where people are image bearers, where they're human, where when you see humanity, you see God. And look in a movement where people are doing, are serving, are giving for goodness in this world. We're going to close this time with the lighting of the Shavuos candles. And traditionally, the mothers in the home light the Shavuos candles, which represent the joy and the peace and the unity of the Sabbath. And then she encircles the candles with her hands 3 times. And as she does that, she says a blessing, and that welcomes in the Sabbath. Blessed are you, Yahweh our God, King of the universe, who has set us apart by his commandments, who has given us Yeshua the Messiah, and has sent us to be a light to the world. Amen. Now, may you actively create and curate a small group where you find God and connection. And may you be part of a movement of humanity where God is seen. Shabbat Shalom.